Imagine standing at the center of a city so vast and so powerful that its decrees could change the lives of millions of people thousands of miles away in an instant. Throughout our long and often chaotic history, humanity has seen the rise and fall of absolute titans, entities so massive they didn't just inhabit the map, they redrew it entirely. We often think of our modern world as the peak of human organization, but if you look back at the sheer scale, wealth, and military might of the dominant empires in every time period, you start to realize that we are just the latest chapter in a saga of power that has been playing out for thousands of years. From the sun-drenched ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the global maritime dominance of the Victorian era, these were the forces that shaped our language, our laws, and our very identity as a species. Today, we are traveling through time to look at the most powerful empires in every era, and the sheer scale of their dominance is enough to make any modern superpower feel like a temporary experiment. Our journey begins in the cradle of civilization, the ancient Near East, where the concept of an empire was first born. If we go back to around 2,300 years before the Common Era, we find the Akkadian Empire, led by Sargon the Great. This was the first time in recorded history that multiple city-states were united under a single central authority. Before Sargon, you had independent cities like Ur and Uruk fighting over patches of farmland. Sargon changed the game. He created a standing army, a centralized bureaucracy, and a postal system. He was the first to realize that you could rule over people who didn't speak your language or share your local gods. The Akkadians set the blueprint for every empire that followed. They proved that with enough military discipline and administrative skill, you could create a state that surpassed the natural boundaries of a single valley or river. While their reign was relatively short in the grand scheme of things, the shadow they cast lasted for millennia. As we move forward into the Bronze Age, we have to talk about the New Kingdom of Egypt. Around 1,500 years before the Common Era, Egypt wasn't just a land of pyramids and tombs, it was a military superpower. Under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II, Egypt pushed its borders deep into the Levant and far south into Nubia. This was the era of the chariot, the high-tech weapon of the ancient world. The Egyptian Empire was fueled by the incredible agricultural wealth of the Nile, which allowed them to sustain a professional warrior class and build monuments that still leave us breathless today. They were the masters of logistics, moving massive armies across Sinai and establishing trade networks that brought cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and gold from the deep south. For centuries, the word of the pharaoh was law, from the Euphrates River to the fourth cataract of the Nile. But as the Bronze Age collapsed, a new and much more terrifying power emerged in the north, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. If the Akkadians invented the empire, the Assyrians perfected the art of the war machine. Operating around the 9th to 7th centuries before the Common Era, the Assyrians were the first to use iron weaponry on a massive scale. They were masters of siege warfare, creating battering rams and movable towers that could breach any city wall. But their power wasn't just in their steel, it was in their psychological dominance. They were the first to use systematic deportation of conquered peoples to break their local identities and integrate them into a massive, multi-ethnic labor force. Their capital, Nineveh, was the largest and most magnificent city in the world at its peak, filled with libraries and botanical gardens. They were the first truly global superpower of the Iron Age, creating an administrative structure so efficient that it allowed them to govern vast territories with a relatively small central elite. The fall of the Assyrians made way for what many historians consider the first great empire of antiquity, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Founded by Cyrus the Great, around 550 years before the Common Era, Persia was a different kind of beast altogether. At its height, it ruled over 40% of the entire human population. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly 1 out of every 2 people on Earth lived under the banner of the Great King. Cyrus was a visionary leader who understood that religious tolerance and local autonomy were better tools for stability than constant oppression. He allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuilt their temple, and he treated conquered kings with respect. The Persians built the Royal Road, a highway system that allowed messengers to travel 1,500 miles in just 9 days. They were the masters of infrastructure, creating the Qanat system of underground irrigation that turned deserts into gardens. They were so powerful that it took the combined genius of Alexander the Great and a total collapse of the Persian royal line to finally bring them down. Speaking of Alexander, we enter the Hellenistic era. While Alexander the Great's empire lasted only as long as his short life, its impact was seismic. In just over a decade, He conquered everything from Greece to India. He didn't just conquer lands. He planted the seeds of a global culture. He founded dozens of cities named Alexandria, which became centers of science, philosophy, and trade. The Greek language became the lingua franca of the elite across 3 continents. Even after Alexander passed away and his generals carved up his territory into successor states like the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, the Greek way remained the dominant force for centuries. This was an era of unprecedented intellectual exchange, where Greek logic met Indian mathematics and Egyptian astronomy. It was the first time the world felt truly interconnected through a single cultural lens. But as the Hellenistic fires began to fade, a new power was rising in the West that would define the very concept of empire for the next 2,000 years, the Roman Empire. Rome didn't start as an empire. It was a republic that accidentally conquered the world. By the time of Augustus, around the beginning of the Common Era, Rome had turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. They weren't just the most powerful military, they were the masters of engineering and law. They built 50,000 miles of paved roads that are still visible today. They perfected the arch, the dome, and concrete, allowing them to build cities that could house 1 million people. Roman law became the foundation for almost every legal system in the Western world. Their legionaries were the most disciplined and adaptable soldiers history had ever seen. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, allowed trade to flourish from the rainy hills of Britain to the deserts of northern Africa. Rome was more than a government, it was a lifestyle, an identity that people from vastly different backgrounds fought to be a part of. Even after the western half fell, the flame continued in the east for another 1,000 years, proving the incredible resilience of the Roman model. While Rome was dominating the west, the Han dynasty was establishing an equal and opposite power in the east. Around 200 years before the Common Era, the Han dynasty unified China and created a bureaucratic system that would endure for millennia. They established the Silk Road, the first true bridge between the Eastern and Western worlds. The Han were masters of innovation, inventing paper, the magnetic compass, and advanced metallurgy. Their civil service examinations ensured that the empire was run by educated scholars rather than just hereditary nobles. This intellectual meritocracy allowed China to maintain a level of internal stability and technological superiority that was unmatched in the ancient world. At its peak, the Han Empire was the demographic and economic equal of Rome, and the 2 superpowers were aware of each other, trading silk and spices through middlemen, essentially creating the first global economic network. As we move into the Middle Ages, the map begins to shift again. In the 7th century, a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, the Rashidun, and later the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. In less than 100 years, the Islamic Empire grew to include the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, and parts of Central Asia. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a golden age of science and culture. While Europe was in what we often call the Dark Ages, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad was translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts. They made massive strides in algebra, medicine, optics, and astronomy. They were the ultimate middlemen of history, connecting the goods and ideas of China and India with the markets of the Mediterranean. The Islamic Empire proved that a shared faith and a shared language could unite a vaster and more diverse territory than even the Romans could manage at their peak. However, the 13th century brought a storm that no one could have predicted: the Mongol Empire. Led by Genghis Khan, the Mongols created the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. They were a force of pure mobility. Mounted on small, hardy horses, the Mongol hordes could travel up to 80 miles a day, striking their enemies with lightning speed and terrifying precision. They conquered China, Central Asia, Russia, and the Middle East, reaching the gates of Central Europe. But the Mongols weren't just about destruction. They established the Pax Mongolica, a period of safety along the Silk Road that allowed for the first real exchange of technology and culture between the Far East and the Far West. It was under Mongol protection that Marco Polo traveled to the court of Kublai Khan. They were remarkably tolerant of different religions, and were the first to use a system of diplomatic immunity. The Mongol Empire showed that a nomadic people could out-organize and outfight the greatest settled civilizations on Earth. After the fragmentation of the Mongols, the mantle of power in the Islamic world was taken up by the Ottoman Empire. For 600 years, from 1300 to 1922, the Ottomans were the bridge between East and West. By conquering Constantinople in 1453, they effectively ended the Roman legacy and established themselves as the premier power in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Ottomans were masters of multiculturalism, using the millet system to allow different religious groups to govern their own affairs. Their military, spearheaded by the elite janissaries and the most advanced gunpowder artillery of the age, was the terror of Europe for centuries. They controlled the trade routes to the east, forcing European powers to look for new ways to reach the spices of India, which backhandedly triggered the Age of Discovery. This brings us to the first truly global maritime empire, the Spanish Empire. In the 16th century, following the voyages of Columbus, Spain became the richest and most powerful nation on Earth. Their silver fleet brought tons of precious metals from the Americas to Europe, fueling a global economy. This was the empire on which the sun never set. They controlled vast territories in the Americas, the Philippines, parts of Italy, and the Low Countries. The Spanish Tercio was the dominant military formation in Europe for over a century. This was an era of massive cultural and biological exchange, known as the Columbian Exchange, which changed the diet and ecology of the entire planet. Spain proved that you didn't need a contiguous landmass to be a superpower. You needed a navy and a global network of ports. As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, the focus shifted to the Qing dynasty in China. This was the final imperial dynasty of China, and at its height under the Qianlong Emperor, it was the wealthiest and most populous empire on the planet. The Qing expanded China's borders to their greatest extent, including Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. China was the manufacturing hub of the world, producing porcelain, silk, and tea that everyone else was desperate to buy. For much of this period, China had no equal. They viewed the rest of the world as peripheral, a view sustained by their incredible internal resources and a sophisticated administrative system that governed over 300 million people. But the 19th century belonged to a small island nation off the coast of Europe, the British Empire. This was the largest empire in human history by total land area, covering a quarter of the Earth's surface and ruling over a quarter of its population. The British Empire was built on the back of the Industrial Revolution and the unmatched power of the Royal Navy. They were the world's workshop, the world's banker, and the world's policeman. From the jungles of India to the plains of Africa and the outback of Australia, the British footprint was everywhere. They spread the English language, the common law system, and the game of cricket to every corner of the globe. Their dominance was so absolute that it is often referred to as the Britannic Peace. They were the first empire to truly master global telecommunications through the undersea telegraph cables and the first to use steam power to shrink the world. The transition to the 20th century saw the emergence of a new kind of power, defined not just by land or colonies, but by industrial output and ideological reach. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the wreckage of the world wars as the two poles of a bipolar world. While we often think of them as nations, they functioned as massive ideological empires, leading alliances that spanned the globe. The US became the master of cultural and economic soft power, with its movies, music, and financial systems reaching into almost every home on Earth. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union controlled a massive land bloc and shaped the political destiny of a third of the world. This was the era of the nuclear shadow, where for the first time, the most powerful empires didn't just have the power to conquer the world, but to end it. The story of these empires is a story of human ambition in its most concentrated form. Each one believed it was the pinnacle of civilization, and each one thought it would last forever. But the map is a graveyard of forevers. The Akkadians are gone. The Romans are gone. The Mongols are gone. Yet each left behind a legacy that we still navigate today. We speak their languages, we use their roads, we obey their laws, and we benefit from the scientific discoveries they funded. The power they wielded was immense, but it was also fragile, balanced on the edge of economic shifts, military innovations, and the unpredictable whims of history. Think about the sheer administrative genius of the Persians or the Han Chinese. They didn't have computers or satellites. They had thousands of scribes, millions of miles of paper, and horse-mounted messengers. Yet, they managed to collect taxes, maintain order, and fund massive public works across distances that would take months to travel. That is a level of human organization that is hard to even conceptualize in our age of instant communication. We often underestimate our ancestors, but these empires show that they were every bit as capable of big-picture thinking as we are today. The military innovations of these empires also tell a fascinating story. Every era has its game changer. The chariot for the Egyptians, the iron sword for the Assyrians, the horse archer for the Mongols, and the dreadnought for the British. Power usually resided with whoever could master the latest technology and pair it with a superior social organization. But technology alone was never enough. Rome didn't conquer because they had better steel. They conquered because they had a better system for integrating those they defeated. They turned enemies into citizens, a trick that many modern nations are still trying to figure out. The economic reach of these empires is another staggering factor. The Roman denarius, the Spanish silver real, and the British pound sterling were all, in their time, the global currency. They were the glue that held the world's markets together. When the Roman economy sneezed, the spice traders in India felt the chill. When the British went to war, the price of tea in America changed. We live in a globalized world today, but these empires were the ones who did the heavy lifting of connecting the continents for the first time. They were the architects of the global supply chain, long before the invention of the shipping container. But we must also acknowledge the cost of this power. Every empire mentioned was built on the back of monumental human effort, and, often, monumental suffering. The pyramids, the Great Wall, and the colonial railroads were all paid for in the sweat and lives of millions of anonymous workers. To be an empire meant to be a predator, to take resources from the periphery and bring them to the center. This pattern of extraction and dominance is the darker side of the grand history. The monuments we admire today are often built on foundations we would rather not think about. This tension between cultural achievement and human cost is the central theme of every imperial story. The golden ages of these empires are often the periods we remember most fondly. The Islamic House of Wisdom, the Pax Romana, the Victorian era. These were times when, under the shelter of a giant power, the human mind was free to explore art, science, and philosophy. It seems that for most of history, peace was only possible under the shadow of a sword. It took a massive central authority to suppress the local feuds and tribal conflicts that plagued the gaps between empires. This imperial peace was often the only time that regular people could travel or trade in safety. It's a complex legacy, where the very force that oppressed you was also the one that protected you from 1,000 smaller dangers. As we look at the rise of these powers, we also see a pattern in their fall. Almost all of them followed a similar cycle: expansion, consolidation, stagnation, and finally collapse. Usually it was a combination of overextension, where the empire simply became too big to govern, and internal rot, where the ruling elite lost sight of what made them powerful in the first place. High taxes, failing infrastructure, and a lack of innovation eventually made them vulnerable to outside threats or internal revolt. Rome didn't fall because of one barbarian invasion. It fell because its systems was already broken from within. The role of geography in these stories cannot be overstated. Egypt was protected by its deserts and fed by its river. Britain was protected by its channel and fed by its navy. China was shielded by its mountains and plateaus. Each empire was a product of its environment, taking the unique advantages of its location and using them to project power outward. But eventually geography becomes an obstacle. The Persians couldn't master the Greek mountains, the Romans couldn't master the Germanic forests, and the British couldn't master the vastness of the American and African interiors. The earth eventually wins every battle against those who try to claim too much of it. Religion and ideology also served as the bedrock for many of these powers. The mandate of heaven in China, the divine status of the pharaoh, the caliphate in Islam, and the civilizing mission of the British. Every empire needed a story to tell its citizens and its subjects. They needed a reason why they deserved to rule. This ideological glue was often more effective than any army. It provided a shared sense of purpose and a framework for law and order. When the story changed, or when people stopped believing in it, the empire was usually not far behind. The cultural exchange that happened during these periods is what truly shaped the modern world. Think about the food you eat. The Romans brought grapes and olives to Europe. The Spanish brought chocolate, potatoes, and tomatoes from the Americas to the rest of the world. The Mongols brought gunpowder and paper-making technology from China to the West. Our global culture is a giant patchwork quilt, and each square was sewn on by a different empire. We are the cultural descendants of all of them, a mutt species that is the result of thousands of years of imperial mixing. The most powerful empires were also the greatest patrons of the arts. Shakespeare flourished under the British, the Han writers perfected the art of history, and the Islamic poets created some of the most beautiful literature in human existence. Art requires wealth and stability to reach its peak, and empires provided both in abundance. They wanted to show off their greatness, and so they hired the best minds to paint their walls, design their buildings, and write their songs. The beauty we see in our museums today is the refined essence of imperial power. We also see the recurring theme of metamorphosis. Rome didn't just disappear. It became the Catholic Church and the various nations of Europe. The Ottoman legacy still influences the politics of the Middle East. The British Empire transformed into the Commonwealth. Empires don't usually die in a single day. They dissolve into the world around them, leaving their DNA in the languages we speak and the borders we draw. Even the borders of many modern nations in Africa and Asia were drawn with a British or French ruler on a map 100 years ago. We are literally living in the geometry of the 19th century imperial mind. The study of these powers is a lesson in humility. We are currently living in a peculiar moment in history, a unipolar or multipolar world, where the rules of the game are shifting faster than ever. We look back at the Romans or the Qing and think of them as ancient, but to them, they were as modern and as permanent as we feel today. They had their own celebrities, their own political scandals, and their own technological revolutions. Understanding their story helps us place our own moment in the long, flowing river of time. It reminds us that power is a loan, not a gift. It is also worth reflecting on the role of the individual within these massive systems. Behind every empire was a Cyrus, an Augustus, a Genghis, or a Victoria. But there were also millions of people whose names we will never know, who kept the gears turning. The tax collector in a dusty Persian province, the Roman centurion on the Rhine, the British shopkeeper in Hong Kong. The story of empires is a collective human effort, a testament to what we can achieve when millions of people pull in the same direction, even if they are forced to do so. As we move toward the future, the definition of an empire is changing again. We are entering an era where data, artificial intelligence, and corporate reach might become more important than land or soldiers. We might be witnessing the birth of digital empires that rule over our attention and our wallets rather than our territory. Will they follow the same cycles of rise and fall? Will they leave behind monuments as enduring as the pyramids or the Colosseum? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain: the human urge to build something larger than ourselves, to project our will across the horizon, is not going away. It is embedded in our nature. We are builders of systems. We are creatures of order. We are the architects of empires. Whether we are doing it on the banks of the Nile or in the cloud-based servers of the Silicon Valley, the drive is the same. We want to leave a mark. We want to be remembered. We want to be powerful. The most powerful empires in every time period provide us with a roadmap of our potential and our pitfalls. They show us what happens when we reach too far, and what happens when we build foundations that last. They are a mirror held up to the human soul, reflecting our greatest achievements and our deepest flaws. They are the grand drama of our existence, played out on the biggest stage possible. So the next time you look at a passport, or use a piece of paper, or drive on a highway, take a moment to remember where those things came from. They are the artifacts of the empires that came before us. We are walking through their ruins even as we build our own world. We are the inheritors of their language, their laws, and their vision. The history of empires isn't just a list of dates and battles. It is the story of how we became who we are. It is the story of us. In every era, there was a force that defined what was possible, a power that stood above the rest and said, "This is how the world will be." And as we continue our own journey through time, we carry the lessons of those giants with us. We know that power is fleeting, that culture is resilient, and that the only thing that truly lasts is the impact we leave on the world. The sun has set on many empires, but it always rises on a new one, and the dance of power continues, forever carving new shapes into the history of our planet. Keep looking back, for in the shadows of the old empires, we find the blueprints for the world of tomorrow.